Close.
Oh, it is, okay. All right.
All right, take it away, Cole.
Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out. So I'm presenting on my senior research, and my title today is What's the Buzz? Honey as a bioindicator for air pollutant deposition in the eastern United States.
Click on the screen. There.
There it is. All right. So air pollution. Air pollution consists of chemicals or particles in the air that can harm humans, the environment, animals, and they're mainly generated anthropogenically through emissions in the form of emissions from factories and cars, especially. So they tend to sit around population centers, cities, and where these factories and stuff, the burning of fossil fuels is happening. They're not entirely understood, their dynamics, where they go, and how they're interacting with things. And they're difficult to monitor, which is part of why they're not entirely understood. So this here on the right is a nice little demonstration of some pathways. So these are various ways that emissions can enter the atmosphere. Stationary, this is like factories, burning, and then vehicles. So these are what I am mainly looking at here. And some pollutants of interest include sulfate and nitrate. These are big, mostly generated in the form or through fossil fuel combustion, and then transported into the atmosphere where they interact and evolve into new substances that can have harmful effects when they come back down and deposit on the surface, or they sit above as haze. And then chloride, phosphate, and bromide. These are some other pollutants of interest to me. They're not necessarily air pollutants, but using the methods that I'll describe next, it looks like we can get a good look at these and where they might be. Also, I'm interested in particulate matter, but I'll come back to that soon. So I hypothesize that honey can be used to better understand the spatial distribution of air pollution. And then I believe that the data we can acquire through honey can help us map out and convey this information to a broader audience. So first, turn your attention to this diagram on the left here. Why honey? Well, there's a number of ways that pollution can enter the environment. It can go through the air, through soil, through water. These pathways are each interacted with by honeybees. And when they forage.
Excuse me, Cole.
Yes.
Your purpose is if they want to get into the room.
Oh.
You should call
Go. So there are multiple pathways by which these pollutants can enter honey. And so when honeybees are foraging, they forage generally within a 2-kilometer radius, and they can travel up to 15 kilometers per day. And this happens thousands of times on the scale of the hive. So they make for excellent samplers. They're high density. One of the problems with air pollution is that you need lots of instruments to measure exactly where it's going, what it's doing. Spatio-temporally, it varies a lot. But honeybees, since there are a lot of them and they are constantly collecting information, running into particles and taking them back to the hive, they're great for collecting and sampling and then analyzing. So this negates the need for an array of instruments, which could be expensive or could be difficult depending on where you are performing your study. And then it's a low cost, low maintenance method. You can just plop a hive down and they'll get to work. So, and they can be sourced from beekeepers, wherever there are beekeepers. Yeah. So honey's history as a biomonitor. This was first used as a study system by Svoboda, 1962, who monitored strontium-90 produced by nuclear experiments in Europe. And the results from this showed that the chemical composition of the area is reflected on the body of worker bees and in the hive products that they produce. So this is a very interesting finding that has been used for many contaminants since. Radionuclides, heavy metals. Here on the right is a diagram of the use of this, looking at metals found within honey and mapping this out. And this is one way in which I would like to present my research in the end, but looking at different contaminants that are mainly air pollutants. So this kind of research is lacking in the United States and lacking, I mean, in the Western Hemisphere in general. Most of the studies have been done in Europe, and the ones that have been done over here, the ones that have been done really most places, don't convey information in this way. So they may not be quite as useful. But I'd like to build upon this, take it here, and then introduce new ways to study new pollutants like sulfate in this way. So previous work, my study builds upon the study of our very own Jim Castee, who he analyzed the cesium content of honey based on its cycling through soil. So thinking back to those pathways, his looked at that soil pathway and how it enters through plants, cycles into plants, and then how the bees collect that and subsequently concentrate it into the honey. And so he found that, well, lower soil potassium generally led to greater cycling of cesium into honey. So this study mainly looked at leftover contaminants from nuclear bomb tests, so 1960s onward or so. So my study, I want to look at that air pathway once again, and using honey to measure modern contaminants, modern emissions of air pollutants that are being generated on a year-to-year basis and that can be monitored in real time. So sulfate, I've said it a lot. What is it? So it's generated through the oxidation of sulfur dioxide. This is mainly produced in fossil fuel combustion, especially coal-fired power plants. These are referred to as sulfate plumes because once they release their emissions within these plumes, there are reactions that take place that oxidize sulfur dioxide into sulfate. This can then turn into particulate matter, or it can be incorporated into rain, forming acid rain and haze. So these are known for their destruction of forests and ecosystems that we've been able to witness in the Northeast and other places around the world. And they also have adverse effects to human health. So the emission of sulfate is also, well, emissions in general are also directly correlated with the deposition. So where this is taking place, there's also greater number of, or greater amount of deposition of the same contaminants. And why this is of such interest to me is because sulfate can be tracked in honey, and that's been revealed through preliminary studies, and it seems to be a pretty consistent contaminant that shows up. So to illustrate the dynamics between emission and deposition, here on the left, I have this map that shows the distribution of sulfate plumes or sulfur dioxide point sources within the eastern United States. The Ohio River Valley here, and then this corridor along the Atlantic coast are highlighted because there's such a high concentration of these units that are producing these emissions. So these are interesting to me because, well, as you can see, there's a direct link between where this is occurring and where this is being deposited the most. So based on these data, I am building my own Transect and expecting that sulfate is going to be higher in these areas that are in those red zones, are in those areas of high emissions. So this is a transect that I've established between Williamsburg and southwestern Pennsylvania. So based on previous studies, based on these maps, I've expected that honey would reflect the same correlations, the same emissions and deposition of sulfate, especially in honey. And let's see. So it crosses these boundaries from Virginia up through Pennsylvania. And so I basically expect it to run from low to high, where this is the highest concentration of those power plants. And I should say that these blue and red dots represent energy generating and non-energy generating units. Those are things like coal-fired power plants, paper plants, and things of that nature. So based on these, well, I'm using ion chromatography to analyze these honey samples. So what this here is an ion chromatograph. This is the one machine that I'm using for my research. And it's set up to register conductivity. So a sample fluid runs through this machine here and into this column, this black column here, which contains positively charged beads that cling to anions within the solution that's running through it. So then an eluent pushes out those negatively charged anions progressively over time, and then into a conductivity sensor, which then registers each of those fluctuations as peaks that correspond to the amount of however much substance is hitting the sensor at any given time. And so some of these are of great interest to me. Like this here represents chloride, this one here represents sulfate, phosphate, and so on. And so these then can be analyzed and then put into something like this. So here are some preliminary results of tests that I've run over the past few weeks. And as you can see, there are some great variations in the sulfate content of honey. And this here is especially interesting. This represents that initial transect that I have. These come from other honey samples that we have in our collection, just to get a broader data set. But as you can see, it's greatest in this region here. And so, as I expected before, I thought that the Ohio River Valley, as you got further into it, you would get higher concentrations of sulfate. It looks like that's not entirely the case. It's a little more complicated than that, because this here, not as much as down here. And what could be driving this massive increase in sulfate in West Virginia? Not entirely sure. It could have to do with the mountains, because the Appalachian Mountains do run along this line here. So it could be that those are just collecting these contaminants, and then these are just interacting more heavily with them. So yeah, so this is the overview of the first part of my study. And this will also be done for nitrate, chloride, and other contaminants of that nature. But then I'm also interested, as you'll remember at the beginning, I mentioned these particulate matter This is what I was referring to, these magnetic iron spherules. So these particles, they're still relatively new when it comes to research and understanding, and their dynamics, where they are, and what they come from. So little is known, but there are these nearly perfect spheres that generate on a wide scale of sizes, from tens of micrometers to just nanometers. And the nanosized particles tend to accumulate into these aggregates. So this is actually hundreds of little tiny nanoparticles. As you can see, these are less than a micron long, that have stuck together. And these were found in the air, whereas the one on the left was found in a marine sediment core downwind of an urban center. So these are rounded airborne magnetite particles that are ubiquitous in urban particulate matter. So they're formed via combustion. They're released into the air and quickly cool into these shapes. Vehicle brakes are thought to be a very large source of these particles. The vehicle brakes heat up, and metal is like released into the air, and then so these particles are formed. Industrial and power plant fly ashes are also a known source of these particles, and they're associated with industrialization. If you'll turn your attention here, just ignore this Herm value and focus on this gray line. So this comes from a sediment core downwind of what was once a village in Taiwan that rapidly industrialized into a major urban center. And that took place right about here. And you can see right as that process began, there was a large spike in these spherules. And well, the authors attribute this to air pollution due to urbanization and industrialization. They've also found that magnetic susceptibility near roads is higher. They're talking about vegetation near roads in the study in Taiwan, or not in Taiwan, in Thailand. And they attribute this increase in magnetic susceptibility to the presence of these little iron spherules. So their implications of these little particles, well, they've been observed in the human brain, and they're expected to interfere with some functions, which could be problematic. It's not entirely understood what they do, but the little nanoparticles are able to make their way into the brain, and it's never good to get things in your brain. They've also been found to enhance atmospheric heating. And of course, the last thing humans need is another thing, heating up the atmosphere. So understanding them and getting at where they are and how they are is important for mitigating them and what they could potentially do. So little is known, but my study hopes to illuminate honey as a biomonitor for these particles as well. They've been observed on the body of honeybees, as seen here. This is a little tiny spherule, about 5 microns in size. And I expect them to be found in honey, especially near heavily trafficked areas, because it does seem that the breakware is the main source of these things. And I also have reason to believe that they're honey, because this picture here on the right is an aggregate of little tiny spherules, which I believe are the same types of spherules. And this is just over 5 microns in length and circumference, but there are, of course, many hundreds of these at a time. So one thing I want to do along that same transect is look into honey with a scanning electron microscopy, pulling these things out, and then explaining their presence and seeing if this can be used as a study system to monitor them as well, just like air pollution. So the significance of all this work, well, understanding and adapting. So air pollution is on the rise and poses significant threats to ecological and human health. So gathering information on pollutant spatial dynamics, where it's being deposited, how long it's persisting in the environment, is important. Pollutant effects on organisms, knowing what they're doing to both plants, insects, animals, and then being able to gather this information over a wide range of conditions and not needing to establish those individual instruments. This all helps inform decisions that shape human environment interactions. And down here is an example of a success story, how certain policy was implemented in the 80s and 90s that led to a subsequent decrease in acid rain, sulfate and nitrate concentrations in this lake in the Adirondacks. So it is important and it is necessary to inform these decisions. So amidst rising populations, resource demand, and decreasing biodiversity, honey offers a robust and flexible study system that can provide a deeper assessment of air pollution, including the monitoring of lesser recognized contaminants like these iron spherules. It allows us to develop conservation strategies and management from these things. And then also, this would be the first honey air pollutant study in North America, especially looking at those ions like sulfate, nitrate, things of that nature. And also possibly the first to use honey to monitor iron spherules, assuming that could be done. So this would help open doors for the use of honey as a biomonitor and give us some much needed information. So thank you for coming. That's the buzz. Any questions? I think I saw Henry first.
So in one of your earlier slides, you were talking about that somebody was looking at, I think, cesium.
Yes.
And how that was like from the 60s. Do you have any idea what the timeline is like on if you pollute in an area, is the honey going to reflect that fairly shortly after, or?
Okay. For cesium is, so you're asking, could you repeat your question?
Like just, I guess, how quickly does honey reflect pollutants such as the ones you're looking at?
So it depends on the pollutant itself and how long it takes to enter the environment, and it depends on the pathway. So for my particular contaminants, I expect that they enter honey much quicker because of this air pathway that goes directly, from the air into collected by the bees and then into their honey. Whereas the cesium, this was done much later, but it looks like, well, based on previous studies, it looks like that it enters fairly quickly as well because they're able to do this in the 60s. But also that pathway from soil and through vegetation is going to take longer, more likely. And yeah, so it varies depending on the contaminant. Let's see, all right, I'm going to go to Zoom real quick. Paul.
Hey Cole, yeah, great job. That was really awesome. I unfortunately missed the first few minutes, so I have two questions. The first was, do you have any idea what the sense of are these pollutants being deposited by rainfall, or is it more of like dry deposition?
So I'm not sure on which is more influential in the terms of my study, but I'm thinking that the dry deposition is probably more influential in terms of bees interacting with it in the air. So I'm thinking that is going to play a role. But also, the wet deposition does enter the water and the soil, which bees are also interacting. But there's the potential for both with these contaminants.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just had, I guess, more of a suggestion maybe, but have you ever taken a GIS class or worked with the CGA?
I have. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, these are very very early renditions of
Oh, no.
So,
Oh, no. Yeah, no, they were good. I was just going to say that, yeah, like maybe you could like overlay maps of roads or power plants to try to show a really good spatial relationship between what sources could be causing it. And that might help you narrow down exactly which type of pollutant might come from where. And that might just be a cool thing.
that's a really good suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, but everything looked great. Looked awesome.
Thank you very much. In here, okay, I saw you first.
Okay, so in addition to, you said, you talked a lot about sulfate, and then you also mentioned some other like chlorides, I think, and
Yes.
some other
Chloride,
pollutants
bromide.
that you were going to be looking at. Do you have predictions about what those will look like in relation to the sulfate?
So it looks like they're not, it doesn't, well, this also depends on the contaminant, like chloride, for example. It looks like, from what I have, and I have a little bit on that, it looks like that might be higher near coasts where sea salt, sea spray is entering the air, and those chloride molecules are being deposited. But also it is, kind of goes with human development, because we do put a lot of chloride into the environment. And I know that's a problem in the Midwest and whatnot. So, yeah. Let's see. You?
This is kind of tangent, so I don't know if you would know the answer, but I'm just curious. You mentioned that there's like impacts on humans from getting these pollutants in their systems. Do you know if there's any research about like how this affects the hives or like the bees' health if they're getting too much of these pollutants?
Yeah, well, there is this phenomenon called colony collapse disorder. It's not exactly clear what causes it, but it's thought to be a combination of factors and this also has been shown, the collapse of colonies in general, to follow this trend downward immediately after industrialization took place. The study I'm thinking of took place in the United States. So right after the United States industrialized, all these colonies started declining. And so the number of colonies today is a lot less than previously. And it's thought that air pollution is one of the, one of the things, one of the reasons for that. There's also mites that have really ravaged hives. But there's this combination of factors that all are up against bees.
So we've had a lot of wildfires on the west coast for a while now. You anticipate that will have any effect on the results? And if so, do you have a way to control for that?
The wildfires, so the question for Zoom was, do you think the wildfires will affect my results? I don't believe that they'll impact the results much, if at all, because the kinds of things they're generating, VOCs and things, are separate from what I'm looking at. And so I'm looking mainly at anions and these constituents that are generated from fossil fuels, separate from what is generated by like forest fires. Brent?
I have two questions. I assume you don't just feed the honey straight into the land from underground. What kind of process do you go through to do that?
Okay, so the question was, what kind of process is used to put the honey through So I dilute the honey in, I put like about 3.3 grams of honey in with about 6.5 milliliters of water, and then like dilute that and mix it up. And then that solution is then injected into the ion chromatograph. So it's not going directly in, because that would definitely clog the system. Yes, and then part two.
Have you actually found any of these magnetic spherules in honey yet?
Yes, actually, so the question was, have we found magnetic spherules in the honey yet? And yes, we think so. That picture that I went to at the end, the one with the aggregate, that sphere there, that was found in honey, and it's thought that those are the same as these. It's thought that those are what we're looking for.
And I'll just add to that. We find it a lot in rainfall. We've been collecting rainfall and using a magnet to pull out magnetics from it at the Keck lab. And we found a lot of these particles in rainfall just this year. We're not sure where they're coming from, but you might be interested to know that they're pure magnetite. We've put them under the SEM over at the Applied Research Center, and they come out as 100% Fe3O4. So it's really interesting that these are in rainfall and no one really knows much about where they're coming from, but it follows that they'd wind up in honey because they're just following the hydrologic cycle, right? They're just coming down in rain, winding up on the plants, and then obviously as the bees interact with the plants, they can get them into the honey. So it's pretty amazing to me that we're seeing these everywhere. And nobody knows about them. Nobody knows where they're coming from and when they started to be present in the environment.
So Cole, and showing up in the sedimentary record as well?
They are, yes. And that study I showed off the coast of Taiwan.
Sorry, I meant locally.
Oh, locally.
Sorry.
Oh, in this sediment? I'm not sure, because there hasn't been enough research done on them. And nobody's really characterized them in America. So we don't know if they're appearing in sediment here. And we haven't like gone searching in sediment.
We're gonna start looking in Matoka sediments to see if we can figure out when they began to emerge. There's just so much detrital magnetite in the Matoka sediments that it's a little bit trickier to kind of separate the two. But that's something we want to do.
I'll go to Zoom again. Linda.
Yay, all this discussion is probably getting to my answer. I was interested in the large bullet in West Virginia and wondered if that was wet sedimentation from rainfall because you're in the mountains. I didn't know if you had looked at the concentration of rainfall in that area, West Virginia, and see if that could be wet sedimentation from that.
That's a good suggestion, and I haven't yet considered that as a factor, so I haven't looked at that yet, but it is very possible that the concentration of this is happening because of those atmospheric effects, because of the rainfall.
The mountains.
Because of the mountains, yeah. So I'll have to look into that. Thank you. Let's see. Any more?
Thank you, Cole.
All right.